So this is our second salon in our series on the self in the age of simulation. Today, we're going to be talking about body positivity. We have Abigail Favale, who is a professor of theology and literature at Notre Dame. She's also written the books Into the Deep and The Genesis of Gender, which are really awesome. I've read both of them. You should too. And Katherine Dee, who is an internet and culture reporter. Both of you guys have been on my podcast. We've had a lot of interesting conversations about a variety of cultural topics. So I'm very excited to have you guys on for this specific topic. Thank you both for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So with the way I want to start this, so the whole body positivity movement is, I mean, it's hard to kind of pin down what it is specifically, but I think the best way to start is to look at the phenomenon of eating disorders, of the struggles that people have with body image, with their appearance. Let's try to map out how this kind of narrative has evolved over recent years. What changes have we seen in, again, trends with eating disorders, but also with body image more generally? Abigail, why don't you start us off?
Oh no.
Yeah, I think too.
Um, this is a good question because um I feel like I'm not as online and like in touch with popular culture in recent years as I used to be now that I'm an old. Um, but there are I guess there are some things that I would point out. Especially when and I don't know exactly what you mean by recent years, but I'm kind of thinking of like,
Your years while you've been around, I
well,
would
I've
say.
been around. All right, well, I've been on the planet.
Yeah.
So I mean, I feel like in, let's say, the 90s, right?
Okay.
Broadly, there was a lot of talk about eating disorders. There was a lot of concern about eating disorders. There was certainly an escalation in eating disorders, both anorexia and bulimia. And it was very much treated as, or considered to be a bad thing. Like, this is a crisis. This is something that we should respond to, we should be aware of. And it seems like, oh, and also concerns about fad dieting, that sort of thing, or how many girls and women are on diets, right? Um, but it seems like in some ways in recent years, over time, those things have become more and more normalized. Um, Certainly the dieting, I feel like a lot of people are on kind of boutique diets these days, and it's actually seen as something good and healthy. Um, Almost everyone has, not almost everyone, but it's so much more common to have very narrow dietary restrictions, right? All of that has kind of become normalized. I think it's certainly spread to men as well, although it might look different. I think there's a lot of pressure for men to have a certain type of body. Um, and uh, and then I would also say that I think eating disorders are still seen as bad, but then similar behaviors that are kind of harmful to the body are in certain cases, like when it comes to, medicalizing for gender dysphoria, things like that, those are seen as positive and things to be celebrated, right? So I feel like there's been kind of shifts in that way where some of the things that were more concerning or seen as bad in the 90s are now becoming a little more normalized. So that's just one of my initial thoughts, but I'd love to hear what Kat thinks.
Yeah, I agree with you that there's this interesting thing where we push back against diet culture, right? Like we even call it diet culture. But at the same time, like there's all these very niche diets that are popular and even encouraged: keto, paleo, gluten free, when you don't really have a necessity to be gluten free. And that it's now like it's sort of agender. It's not exclusively feminine coded. I also feel like even though there is this idea of like body positivity, um, there's also this pervasive. Thank you, Lucia. Sorry. Um, there, uh, there is also like this increased idea of like you can edit yourself however you feel fit. Um, you mentioned gender dysphoria, and that reminded me of a very interesting interview I did a few years ago with a psychiatrist who was saying that like in her practice, she was seeing young women who were coming in with, they're saying, I've experienced gender dysphoria, and it was manifesting as an eating disorder. And I think that's sort of well known, but not really talked about. And it was considered like a DIY transition, um, going on these very restrictive diets to remove feminine characteristics.
Yeah, and this is something that you, Abigail, touched on in an article you wrote for Church Life Journal about this kind of overlap between gender dysphoria and eating disorders, and you attributed it to this kind of aversion to the attributes of the female body that you thought like eh, in some way is correlated to this kind of like the secularization, disenchantment of the everyday of the body. So yeah, I don't know, could you expound a little bit more on what you were saying in that article and how these issues kind of overlap?
Yeah, and that was my first foray into this conversation. I remember when I wrote that, I think back in 2019, and I was like,
Mhm.
oh, this will be my first and last, article on gender topics, which it wasn't.
Look at
That's
you
that.
now.
No, I'm like, dang it, should have stopped. So in that piece, I think one of the things that I was noting, so I draw on the work of Susan Bordeaux, who's a feminist theorist, and she has this really interesting article where she does this like Foucauldian analysis of eating disorders, and the kind of female anorexic, and she interprets it as basically an unconscious and ultimately self-destructive protest against societal expectations. So in other words, in this kind of hypersexualized, under like in our culture, which the female is hypersexualized, um, as a way to kind of revolt against that, anorexia became a way to basically erase the visible markers of femaleness from one's body, right? Which I think is a really interesting kind of theory or way of reading the phenomenon. And what was also interesting to me, though, is that she, of course, as a feminist theorist, saw this again as something that's ultimately self-destructive. She didn't see it as positive or liberatory, right? Which is why I find it so fascinating now that when it comes to kind of maybe surgically removing the markers of femaleness, right? Or when we see the kind of increase in adolescent onset gender dysphoria, especially among females, similar kinds of self-destructive behaviors are now seen as liberatory, right? It's not presented as for by a lot of people. I mean, obviously it is controversial, but it's not necessarily seen as an unqualified, harmful kind of act. So there seems to be, I think, behind that very much like a shifting narrative in terms of, I guess, what it means to be a woman, what is liberatory, is femaleness essential to being a woman, or all these kinds of interesting questions. Yeah, so that's kind of where I went with that piece at first. And I could talk more about the kind of maybe disenchantment bit, but I wonder if it'll come up later in some of our other conversations. So I'll kind of stop there.
Yeah, I mean, but I want to ask you if you could say a little bit more about what is it in particular about the female body that you were saying, like the fact that, I don't know, you were saying how the curves of the female body are in some way seen as a nuisance, the protrusions of the body are like, I think like in this kind of secularized or technological age, there's this aversion to the stuff that are very clear markers of our humanity, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think a piece of it, I mean, I think part of, I guess, the unconscious kind of response to cultural ideals is that in some ways, modern feminism, I think, has ironically affirmed the masculine ideal for women, right? That's
Mhm.
what it looks like to be a liberated woman is, in a sense, to kind of adopt the physiology of a man. We see this really explicitly in the kind of reproductive realm with contraception. So for women to be free, they really kind of need to technologically intervene and mimic male sterility or male fertility patterns. Um, and then I think that's sort of connected then to this idea that um, that for women to become free, they must unwomen themselves, essentially. That like it is femaleness, it is fertility, it is our capacity for pregnancy that ultimately enslave us. And of course, those are the very things that are signaled by our kind of dimorphic features as women, right? So I think that's part of it, but I also think there's probably a little bit of there's also the dynamic of kind of the pornification of our society where there's also a very pornified and very sterile ideal of femininity that women, and especially young women, I think understandably are in revolt from. So I think part of what's going on maybe in some of the eating disorder and gender dysphoria stuff, which like Kat mentioned, are very much, there's some correlations between them. They're overlapping or comorbid conditions often, is, young women kind of looking around and thinking, if that's what it means to be a woman, right? To be basically a kind of hypersexualized, pornified object of male attention, like I want out, I would rather kind of flee from womanhood altogether. And then that becomes exercised on the body, right? The body becomes then kind of a scapegoat, something that must be kind of controlled and punished, because that's why it's ultimately self-destructive, right? Because the response is understandable because I think of the messed up ideals in our culture, but then it's the body that's ultimately harmed or scapegoated because of that.
Yeah, and I sent you guys this bit by Baudrillard in The Consumer Society, where he says that the reason why the new ideal is the slim, very thin body is because bodies that are more curvy, that are more fleshy, it doesn't fit this kind of virtual simulated ideal, as he says, that we're kind of headed further and further towards. And it's exactly this point that you're making, that like the female body is very much does not fit that kind of ideal. And I'm wondering, Katherine, if you can just given, I don't know, like these Baudrillardian motifs of, again, the virtual, the simulation, what role do you think the internet has played in kind of making us have this aversion to the fleshiness of the body, the humanity of the body, and kind of esteem this very slender ideal?
So something that came to mind as Abigail was talking was in eating disorder specific spaces. So spaces where people promote a very thin, sickly image deliberately and consciously. They used to fit the model that Abigail was describing, where it was often people who maybe had been like victims of sexual assault, who were talking about the removal of these feminine features very consciously, like they were perfectly aware that these were the things motivating their eating disorders. And it's become very sexualized. And that's actually like an open question for me. Like, what is it? Like, what has changed to make this the sexual ideal? Is it the sterility? Is it the idea that like we know these bodies can't bear children and they're for sex alone? Is it this sort of like pedophilic undertone in our culture? Is it something about how sexuality is kind of blending, and like these ideas of like distinct expressions of sexuality are ironically, despite our the flux of new labels, it's actually like there is no gay identity or straight identity. It's sort of one thing right now, and everyone's sort of blending into sameness.
Yeah. So, I mean, now I want to get into the dawn of the body positivity movement as an attempt to kind of undo these harmful ideals, tendencies that people develop. I mean, how would you, in your own words, like how would you describe the goals of this movement, and what extent do you think it's actually accomplishing these goals?
Here, I would love to defer because I wanted to ask someone else, like, okay, what do you mean by body positivity movement, right? Because I have a certain conception of what that might be, but I'd love to hear even just a descriptor.
Catherine,
So
put it.
yeah, so a lot of body positivity comes out of fat liberation, which is sort of a very different thing than what we see now. Fat liberation was a radical movement in the late 60s into the 70s, I think a little bit of the 80s. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's um, against these ideas that there's something lesser about the fat body. And they take a lot of cues from what was like a really radical, specific, niche, small movement. And what body positivity has ultimately become is like, how can we expand the target market for clothes, for sex, for all sorts of things? And that's what it really is in practice. Um, you have like the 2000s where everyone's being fed this diet culture. Paris Hilton's the ideal. In the 90s, you had heroin chic. Kate Moss is the ideal. Sexiness means being skinny. Coolness means being skinny. And this caused a lot of eating disorders. We were very harsh about women's bodies. And it was supposed to be both a correction to this, being less hard on people. But really what it ended up being is like, Victoria's Secret is for everyone, right? It's not just for the Victoria's Secret angel. If you're fat, you can buy this, and you should feel comfortable buying this. You should feel comfortable buying the sex toy. You should feel comfortable taking nude photos of yourself and starting the OnlyFans. There's all sorts of things. You feel comfortable going to the beach, being an influencer, and that's really what it is. It's supposed to be like, let's not shame people on the basis of how they physically present, but it's vanishingly rare for it to be this more positive and I think constructive expression, and frankly, like more feminist expression of it. It's something very different right now.
So Abigail, and that being said, I don't know. So like seeing the fact that there are these kind of pushes to say like, okay, various body types can be beautiful. It's not just the super slim Paris Hilton type. Um, I don't know, what virtues do you see in this movement? What are some of the pitfalls you might see? Yeah, if we were trying to be fair to it.
So yeah, so I kind of have two thoughts that are occurring to me. So the first one would be, of course, the sensation that something is messed up in the way we talk about women's bodies is correct, right? So I think there's a real accuracy in like wanting to push back against this, and especially thinking about how homogenous idealized feminine beauty has become. It's basically kind of reduced to sort of one image, really. And then the goal is to really kind of approximate as much as possible this kind of one image of feminine beauty. And the more beautiful a woman becomes in this ideal, the more she looks like other beautiful women, right? Even hairstyles. I was talking about this with my husband the other day. We were watching some 90s, or we've been rewatching the X-Files, right? And just like commenting on the hair. And I was like, man, there aren't even any like cute, like short haircuts for women anymore. Like everyone has like the long like waves, the tendrils, like all the haircuts look the same. There's just not interesting variation anymore. So I think there's something false and artificial about this vision of feminine beauty. It's too limiting, it's unrealistic, and it's commercialized, right? It's not as if it's this kind of authentic, natural beauty. It is this commercialized, artificial kind of beauty. But I see what the pitfall, though, is it seems like the way we've been talking about the body positivity movement is it's not really critiquing the whole system. It's basically wanting access to the system. It's like, okay, yes, let's continue to think about the body, especially the female body, as a status symbol, as a kind of commercial object, this ideal object that one curates and controls and like creates this project that kind of projects this ideal femininity. Let's accept the fact that it's a consumer product. Let's accept the fact that it's commercialized. We just want access to that status, right? Which of course isn't really going to be successful because the whole purpose of a status symbol is that it is narrow. It's that it is not accessible to everyone, right? That in fact excludes more than it includes, right? So there's just kind of some tensions there immediately, I think, with the whole project.
It's also very confused, which is part of the problem. Like it doesn't always know what it wants. Um, and it's, I think, aversion to criticism makes it kind of confused. Like it does take a lot from fat liberation, which in a certain time and place, like I said, was truly radical. Um, but like the idea that, some of the ideas of fat liberation don't really make sense in a society where our food is poison, where there are no like checks on how people are eating. And so you have all these movements that have a lot of contradictions in them. Like you have body positivity emerging when you with like this very widespread orthorexia, and within body positivity you have this orthorexic face, and you also have the face of like, well, it's not like, what does healthy food mean? There's no such thing as healthy food. Don't we shouldn't criticize people who choose to eat fast food for economic reasons, or then you even get to the point where it's like, oh, it's not an economic choice, it's because that's what they want, and there's no such thing as health. I mean, and that's a real thing. It's a real thing that people say, that there's no such thing as health. And it's just constantly at odds with itself. And so at that point, it's like, what are you accomplishing?
Yeah.
What is orthorexia? Sorry, just real quick. I don't think I've heard that term.
I'm sorry. Orthorexia is an eating disorder where the goal is health, like, ostensibly, but it's really you're slowly subtracting things from your diet. So it's like, oh, there's microplastics in the milk. I can't eat things with a metal fork. I can only use chopsticks. So, there's all sorts of different manifestations of it. And I think a lot of these diets and a lot of these influencers who are like maybe like carnivore influencers, some of the very peat stuff that has become very popular, maybe originally was sort of an offbeat, unconventional interpretation of health, but has become an eating disorder in and of itself.
Yeah, so I have a few things in mind, all that being said. Um, so like I think we need to look at the fact that like a lot of what we're talking about is limited to US culture. There are plenty of cultures around the world where being thin is not only not the ideal, but like sometimes looked down upon. And there's a sense that like people of various body types, shapes can be very physically attractive. Um, but the thing is, like, the thing that I'm seeing with the body positivity movement, like, yeah, the intuition that like only super skinny body types are appealing is false. Like, yeah, I mean, there's merit to this. But to say that you can't just categorically say that every body type and everybody is beautiful. Like some people, I mean, if you dress like a complete slob and like don't do yourself up at all, like you don't look very good. So like beauty is not so much about like, I don't know. My fear is that it's kind of implying that you're beautiful because you tell everyone you are and you're demanding that they accept that you're identifying as attractive, and not really looking at the fact that no, like beauty has to do not so much with your shape or whatnot, but like the fact that you take pride in your appearance, that you carry yourself confidently, that like it does take effort. And I think it's something that everybody could pull off, but the point is that like it's something you do have to pull off. It's not just again like I said I'm beautiful because I am, and therefore so there's this loss of the sense of like no, like beauty is an ideal that we should strive for. I don't know, maybe I'm being too like elitist when I say that, but
I
I don't
think
know,
so.
like
I mean, I
there's
think what gets lost too is that you don't decide beauty for yourself. Often, beauty is decided by things outside of yourself, and that I think is a huge tension point that is unacknowledged.
I mean, I'm not sure if this is what you're getting at, but that was one of the things I was thinking as you were talking about is, I mean, kind of the whole idea of mimetic desire, right? It's not as if desire, like we we are told what to desire. We are taught what to desire. Our we I think even what we find attractive is very profoundly shaped by our culture, right? So I do think that's an important piece that maybe is kind of critiquing. I guess that critique, again, I think is a valid one, that because we're constantly being bombarded with the same kind of hypersexualized, artificial looking femininity, that then is actually kind of, and presenting that as this desirable status object, right? Which then creates this kind of mimetic rivalry, right? Both the desire to be that, but also to kind of be better than that, right? So to hate it, but want to be it at the same time, right? I think that very much fuels what's going on in a way. So it's not as if we kind of have this understanding of what's attractive independent of what our cultural context is constantly telling us what's attractive, right? We almost have to be taught. So in that way, I think actually diversifying the representation of the bodies that we see and the images that we see can be kind of a healthy corrective. Although I think it's better if this is done in real life. I mean, part of the problem is like kind of reducing the body to an image and thinking that that can just be like corrected by lots of different kinds of images. But that just feeds into our tendency now to think about the body primarily in terms of spectacle, in terms of visibility, in terms of being an image or a profile or whatever that needs to be curated, right? So I feel like the body positivity movement isn't getting at the root of the problem. It's just kind of wanting to play the same game, but be involved, be included in the game.
Yeah, and with what you're saying about the fact that a lot of this revolves around like the public image of a person, I'm wondering like, yeah, what role does personality play in the way we perceive someone's attractiveness? Like, again, because I'm saying like there's a difference between someone who's very like adamantly insisting like I am beautiful because I am proud of who I am versus someone who's naturally just confident and you can I don't know like you don't need to they don't need to tell you that they're attractive. Like there's something compelling just about the way they carry themselves. I don't know, like yeah, so like what role do you think that plays, if any?
Um, I mean, I don't think that body positivity is totally locked in the realm of media, right? One thing that's interesting, and this goes back to your question, a little bit of what Abigail was saying is, if you came of age in the 2000s, then women really were mistreated on the basis of their appearance, and of course this was true even before the 2000s. I think it reached sort of a fever pitch, and everything was kind of becoming more obviously and blatantly pornified. And many women had the experience, and young girls had the experience of feeling invisible because of their appearance, of being told they were less than, of growing up in small towns where maybe 50% of the population was obese, but if they were maybe 5 pounds overweight, they were treated like crap. And so body positivity is great there because it's a refuge to like maybe you were invisible or mistreated or told like you weren't living up to um, a certain image of femininity, or even that you didn't feel like you could count as a woman because you didn't fit a certain image. Um, and so I think it's trying to help people who were in that situation, but with the internet and with the confusion of the movement, it's lost that, and also it's also at this point maybe litigating a battle that we're past. It's like I think that there's a time and a place for like Bush era people who are pushing back against like extreme expressions of like evangelical Christianity. If you do that today, it just doesn't make any sense, right? That's why those people look kind of goofy. It's like that made sense in 2004. It's now 2024. What are you fighting back against? I think that's a problem with a lot of these movements, right? I'm even now thinking of like some LGBTQ stuff. Like I'm older. I grew up, when I was in high school, people were debating whether or not it was like ethical to be gay, and there was like gay students, and like that was just fine. No parent would complain about that. You obviously couldn't do that today, but you still have the same advocacy groups who are defending those people. And there's something very similar with like body positivity, where it's like it's almost dated. I'm sorry, I went far afield from your point about personality there. Apologize.
No, but I see the connection though, because yeah, again, I think so much of like these movements in general, like start out with good intentions, but at the end of the day, in terms of like I just wonder what effect do they really have on the way we perceive ourselves, the way we carry ourselves in our everyday lives, not just like in the scope of the public sphere. And I think, I don't know, like this topic of developing one's personality, developing confidence, like that's not something like perhaps a movement, an internet movement might open the door to making that easier for you, but at the end of the day, like that happens through living, like through challenges, through relationships. And if I don't know, like if we're not given the tools to actually live those things out, like, and yeah, then it is hard to develop a mature and an appealing personality, you know. That's just my thought.
Well, something that occurs to me as you were talking, which I'm not sure if I can like totally, this is like a new thought I'm formulating, so I don't know how
Yeah.
coherent it will be. But so there's this kind of concept in Catholic theology about the sacramentality of the body. And one of the ways in which the body is sacramental, it's a visible reality that reveals an invisible reality, is that our body is what reveals our personhood, right? Like our external visible body communicates the kind of interior mystery of our personhood, right? Um, so the body reveals the person is kind of the shorthand for that. And I mean, if the person sucks, then that's going to come through, right? So I feel like in a way, and if you look at even just like ancient wisdom throughout all traditions, there is a sense in which like you need to work on yourself in a certain like there is a sense in which the human being is a project, but it was primarily seen as one that was an interior kind of project. Like you've got to get your shit together, right? Like your will, your desires, they're all misaligned. You have to habituate virtue. This takes work. This might require a certain kind of asceticism, a certain kind of moderation or mortification of bodily desire, so you aren't enslaved to desire, right? But it seems like in our time, like, and I think Baudrillard's getting at this where he talks about how like the body has become almost like the new soul. Like the body is kind of the proxy for this more ancient understanding of cultivating wisdom in a kind of interior sense that then kind of shines through in your embodiment, right? But now it's just about the body. It's like just about making the body this kind of idealized object. But there's not a sense in which like it just feels like it's been inverted in a way, right? That we're working on the wrong things, right? We're like obsessing about the wrong things. We're obsessing about the exterior, about the visibility of the body, and like leaving the soul completely untended. And then we're just wanting to kind of claim a sense of beauty when I think you're right. Like there's a sense of beauty that is something that more is kind of a manifestation of an interior beauty. Right. I don't know. I'm kind of like not
Yeah.
totally tying that together, but you kind of those are some of my thoughts that I'm having.
I think you make that's a great point, and like I think of sort of the commercialization of activism and these very kind of like ineffectual but very like visible expressions of activism being proxies for being a good person and working on your soul, and this like disconnect um, between I mean basically like the disconnect between your body and your actions, what it means to be a good person, and how all of these things have sort of been siloed away into checklists, things you can do, things you can fix, things you can change, and they're very disconnected from one another.
Yeah. And I think again, like this reflects the general like uprooting of our sense of identity from the real, from the concrete implications of our everyday lives. So this is why like many of us may consider ourselves moral people because we check all these boxes, but like how do we actually treat the people that we encounter on the day to day? There's this disintegration. And so in a moment, I'm going to invite our guests. If you guys want to ask questions, we can open the floor to that. But I did want to just say another point about this personality thing. I think I shared with you guys the article where I quoted this Camille Paglia, Naomi Wolf beef that they had back in like the 90s, early 2000s. where like Polly is saying like, okay, you know, people like Naomi Wolf, these types of feminists want to blame men and society for, you know, these oppressive beauty ideals that are imposed on women. And she's kind of arguing like, okay, it's possible to see someone who's beautiful, who fits a certain ideal that you don't, and say, hey, like I recognize the beauty and I appreciate it. And it's not necessarily something like I don't have to look like this model or this actress in order to feel good about myself. And I think, I don't know, like that kind of trope makes me think of Christopher Lasch and all this stuff about pathological narcissism that I think is endemic to Western societies, to secularized societies, where like because our egos are so fragile, because we lack any true foundation upon which we can bank our value, our existence, as soon as we see some ideal outside of ourselves, or we see someone, at least like in a mimetic Girardian sense, like we see someone who is esteemed by others, and like we have to now copy them because if I don't have any value. And if that's how we're gonna live our lives, like then we're never gonna be happy because there's always gonna be someone else, you know. So I'm just wondering, like maybe we can comment on this kind of like interiorized narcissism, this kind of mimetic envy that we have. Yeah, any thoughts about that? Or maybe it's not real. Maybe it's all in my head. I don't know.
I don't think it's all in your head. I'll say that.
There's something to it.
Well, I remember, I mean, that was kind of Baudrillard's language, which let me see if I can get a good quote where he kind of talks about the I don't know, I think I have it here. Where because he uses the language of narcissism. Um, okay, yeah, here we go. Yeah, so he talks about how the body is this kind of almost become this kind of fetish object. And it has like a narcissistic relation. It's a managed narcissism operating on the body, right? Because there is like a self or an I that's being expressed by the body, but I think it's narcissistic because there isn't a sense that that self needs to be good or needs to have virtue or needs to be formed. It's just like, I'm awesome. I'm awesome and I'm special. And I want everyone to think I'm awesome and special. Right. And so I'm going to kind of curate my body in a way that fits this kind of ideal, even as I'm ironically trying to express myself, even though the self is just kind of an image, like, or is a double of the mimetic rival, if that makes sense. Right. So, I mean, our desires are so being shaped through this whole process that there isn't like a self that's being authentically expressed, right?
Yeah.
Like that's, even though it's called, it's kind of referred to as like self-expression, right? So I think that's the kind of narcissism and the mimesis happening in a way, because there's like there seems to be a lack of awareness that the ideal that I want and that I think I am is an ideal that has been given to me that I'm imitating. Right.
Yeah, and like I don't know, if I like looking at my own experience, I see how much I don't know, like I'm definitely a product of my times. I see how much I feel that mimetic kind of rivalry with people. I feel whatever insecurities when I see someone who's, you know, receives public esteem for some ideal that they fit that I don't. And I realize I don't feel as trapped by it because I do have like I happen to have a kind of broader metaphysical worldview. Like I believe that there's more than just me and the public. Like I believe that there's, you know, there are certain virtues, like you said, Abigail. I think there's a God and all that. So like I have something to fall back on when I catch myself falling into that kind of Lashian mode. But I can imagine if there's nothing, like if you don't believe in anything outside of what you see is what you get, like it's really hard to escape this kind of mimetic matrix. Um, so I don't know. I mean, at this point, I do want to open the floor to you guys if you have questions. Also, if Abigail, Kat, if you want to ask each other questions, we can feel totally free. But yeah, you guys can unmute if you want to ask something.
Everyone immediately looks down.
I know,
Wanna
like,
be called
Yeah, no, it's
no
cool.
pressure.
Yeah.
I mean,
had some
I'm just oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say I had thoughts that could be questions, but you've all given me a lot to think about that now I don't know where those questions went. So
But feel
you
free
say
to
what you were
share
gonna say,
your
Kat.
thoughts. Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious what, I'm curious what Abby and Jose, you guys think of, is body positivity even a coherent movement? Is it something that can be pointed to? Is it an ambient feeling? Is it a vibe? And is it a marketing campaign? Like what exactly is it in your opinions?
I guess my reactive opinion here, which is just off the cuff, shooting from the hip here, is that this all is about consumerism. This is all about selling products. This is all about making money. Like that's why I would disagree with, Naomi Wolf or whatever. This isn't about the patriarchy. This is about consumerism. This is about making us perennially unhappy with who we are and who we cannot avoid being. Like our bodies are like, what's ironic about all this stuff is that like our souls can actually be formed. Like there's a lot of malleability there. Our bodies are like a lot less malleable. They're a lot less fluid. They're hard to work with. It takes a lot more work, but in our culture, we've become obsessed with kind of pushing against the materiality of the body and kind of, letting the kind of immaterial part of ourselves go unformed, right? We kind of we take what is fluid to be fixed, and then we try to take what is fixed and force it to be fluid. And so I think that's like an inherently self-defeating and angst-producing state to exist in. And it's also a great way to sell people things that will resolve that angst, quote unquote. So I think even the attempt to kind of, have different body types up and the Target posters, is just an attempt to sell more things, right? It's reinforcing this idea of the body as the status symbol. And it's just trying to kind of draw other people into that status symbol. I don't know. That's kind of my thought.
I think it's more than status, though. I think it is. I totally agree with you. It's about consumerism, but it's also like, in some way, it's like more people are fat. We can't market Abercrombie and Fitch just to thin people because it's not enough people. Right. It's clothing. It's like you have to open it up, and it's under the guise of let's make everyone feel welcome, everyone feel happy. But it's also like, well, who's going to buy our stuff if we've been marketing it only to 70-pound, white women? Like, how many of those women exist, right? Like, you need to,
yeah, and you can't be.
Around.
No, that's right. That's right. Because you can't be a mimetic rival if there isn't that similarity. You have to be able to see that it's possible that you could be that, right, in order to want it. I think if it's too disparate, then that's not going to work. That dynamic is going to be interrupted. I think you're right. It's interesting.
I'm gonna risk saying this is my like semi-risque hot take on all this. I just think like everyone's born with a kind of with their own like natural body type based on bone structure, fat to muscle ratio, whatever. Like I just think the ideal is to try to maintain whatever comes naturally to you. Like for example, like my maternal grandmother always was very big because that's just how her body is. And because I guess she didn't grow up in the US, like she was never like insecure about her size and but like did herself up and always wore like very trendy, bright colored clothes. And I don't know, like I don't see like I thought she was beautiful. And it's in part because yeah, like she was her natural self, but also like was confident. But then the other thing that like I also think it like your ideal should also be determined by like what you actually do in life. So like I am not an athlete and I'm not a model. So I don't see why I would like try to have a very ideal like muscular physique because it does not serve like what I do in life. Whereas if that's what you do, or like I don't know, like if you're a father and you need to like take care of your kids and protect them and your wife, like okay, like I see the value of trying to like develop some muscle mass, but like the same thing, like if you're a mom and you're like a toothpick, like that's going to be really hard to carry your child around and to breastfeed. So like I do think, and maybe in an Aristotelian sense, like your telos should have some kind of influence on which type of body you idealize. I don't know. Maybe not that controversial of a take, but yeah,
Maybe not with this crowd.
with this crowd, others but yeah. All right. Any other things, questions, thoughts that any of us wanna bring up before we close?
Something I've been thinking about, and I mentioned in passing, I've been sort of like trying to unpack. It's like, why is it um, that the like a very thin, uh, featureless in some ways, but childlike body has become sexualized? And I offered some suggestions earlier. Um, I it to me it actually it really is an open question and a very disturbing one.
Mm, it is a good question. And I don't know if this is related, but like children's dolls are like way like super weirdly sexualized. Um, even more than Barbie. Like I don't know, LOL dolls like deeply disturb me. And I have
Yeah,
like
like
two of my
every
children
time I
really
go to
like
the store.
them, and I'm like there are some that even actually have genitalia.
Oh,
Like they have, because there are like boy ones that have tiny little testicles.
really?
Not joking.
Oh, weird.
I'm like, why? I don't know. I'm disturbed by some of these things. Like, why are the yeah, why is what's sexy and the world of the child like kind of weirdly overlapping in our
I wonder
culture?
too if it's because they're not for kids. Like they're incidentally for children.
Mm,
A lot of adults buy toys. I like the thing that sort of set me. I don't know if you've seen Star Babies. That's another doll, and they look
oh yeah.
like anatomically accurate fetuses. And it's like, why would a little girl want that? Because it's not for a little girl. It's for a little girl, but it's for an adult.
I'm with
I
Jose
think
right
that's
now. I'm
true.
like, "Ugh."
Yeah.
It's so
I
disturbing.
think what if I think we should bring back the Bratz dolls from the early
They're
2000s. Because they were just cool. I don't know. It's like a little bit more risque than Barbie, but
I mean, that's kind of what the LOL dolls are, but they have like their eyes are even more like high on ecstasy eyes. Like but then they all have like big hips and little boobs
Well,
and
what's disturbing
you know,
about the LOL ones are that they are like younger brats. They're
yeah.
like babies. They're like
Yeah.
baby. It's messed up.
Yeah. Thank you for validating me. I'm always like, when my
Yeah.
kids want them. Yeah.
don't know to the LOL dolls.
I just stick to Legos. Stick
Yeah.
to Legos.
Legos. Yes. Yes. Legos, they're nice and rectangular. Yes. It's a good
And they
idea.
require like real work to build. Like you
Yeah.
actually have to,
It's
think.
true. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. All right, guys. So this was good. I think yeah, Catherine, the question you just asked, like I think this should be an open question. Like, why is it that we idealize these very kind of slim, sterile body types? And I think I think kind of the consensus that we've reached is like the body positivity movement has a lot of valid intuitions or goals, but perhaps doesn't dig deep enough into the again like the deeper question of like why do we have certain ideals? Why do we have these insecurities? Why do we feel envious of certain types of people. Yeah, Jose.
Earlier you were talking about um, the maybe the feminine desire to be more, or just the drive to make the female body more like a man's. Reminds me of an article, Unmarked Women by Deborah Tannen, and there's um it's almost maybe not, it's like the androgynous is kind of like the baseline. And I think a lot of what you're talking about might go back to something like that, that's the baseline for it. I'm a high school teacher, and so I come at this thinking that when I started teaching body positivity, um, almost had nothing to do with what you're describing. And the body dysmorphia that we saw were eating disorders, and that was a big thing when I started teaching. Now it's very different, but I wonder how that, almost like that baseline is the ideal of innocence, and you know like all my kids, until they hit puberty, they all look the same. They have the same, the same shape, right? And so something happens there, and I wonder if that's why the dolls are like that too.
That's interesting.
Yeah, no, and I think the other thing that I would say is worth considering is like the role that I don't know, like the formative relationships that young people have, whether it's with parents, educators, friends, like because sure, there's plenty of signaling from the mass media, but also like I don't know, what are like I think of again, like having family members who did not fit that kind of ideal, but were very confident, like that sends a message to I don't know, the people who are in their proximity. Whereas if you have someone who's very has a negative view of themselves, like it's probably going to rub off on their children or whoever, you know. So again, it's like I don't think we should discount the role that like the media people we're with every day, like the influence they have, not just the celebrities and what we see on TV and all that. But you know, all right. Okay, so Abigail, Catherine, thank you guys for having this discussion, and I hope we can continue thinking about these questions because they're interesting, and I do think they're really important. So yeah, so follow their work. I know you guys are both on Twitter. Abigail, you have your books out, which everyone should read. And we have two more salons in this series. We have one on Friday about faith in a globalized world. We have John Milbank, Shadi Hamid, and Bill Kavanaugh, some of my favorite people. And then Catherine will be back on Saturday with Esme Partridge. We're going to talk about spirituality and TikTok, social media, new age kind of stuff. Should be fun. But yeah, thank you guys for joining.